Travel towards the west of America began in the 1830s, when hunters called mountain men travelled westwards to hunt animals in the mountains. They located a safe trail from the east to the west, and this became known as the Oregon Trail. Increasingly throughout the 1830s, more people started travelling along the Oregon Trail to start a new life in the West, in Oregon. There was lots of reasons for this. Partly, it was because the land in the East was very expensive, whereas in the West, you could buy land for $1 an acre, which was cheap. There was a lot of problems in the East. Around 25% of people were unemployed. So again, they were hoping to go to Oregon to start a new life. These people are known as the early pioneers. Travel along the Oregon Trail was very dangerous and very long. It was over 2,000 miles. It would take at least 6 months to make the journey. The pioneers had to walk. They had a wagon with them, which was pulled by oxen, but they couldn't travel on the wagon because that was carrying their stuff, and they would also sleep in the wagon at night. But they had to walk beside the wagons. There was lots of dangers on the Oregon Trail. Wild animals like wolves, Native American attacks, catching illnesses like cholera from dirty water, getting injured, having to go through mountains where it could be snowy, having to cross the Great Plains where it would be boiling hot, lack of food, lack of water. Lots and lots of people died on the Oregon Trail because it was dangerous and it was physically exhausting. In the 1840s, more and more people start to move to the west. This is because Oregon officially becomes part of the United States. In the 1830s, when people had started going to Oregon, it was actually owned by Britain, but it becomes part of the USA in the 1840s. So therefore, more Americans want to go there because it's now part of their country. California, also in the West, became part of the USA in the 1840s. California had been part of Mexico, but in the 1840s, a war breaks out between America and Mexico. America win that war and therefore take a lot of land off Mexico, including California and huge amounts of land in the West. Therefore, because California was now part of the USA, lots more white Americans want to travel there and live there. The reason that people want to go is for the same reasons that the early pioneers had gone. The land was much cheaper in Oregon and California. You could get it for about $1 an acre. And also, things are not very good in the East. There's a lot of unemployment. The land is very expensive. So more and more people decide to go to Oregon and California, which are now part of the USA. They travel along the Oregon Trail, and then if they go into California, they then take, once they get to a certain point, they take a different route which goes southwards towards California. They face the same difficulties the early pioneers had travelling along those trails. Another reason that people decided to go west in the 1840s was the idea of manifest destiny. This was the belief of all of the white Americans, including the government, but also normal people, that God wanted white Americans to spread out and live across the entirety of North America, not just on the East Coast where they had been, but all the way across. This became a belief that a lot of Americans wanted to fulfill, that God wanted them to spread out and take over all of North America. One group of people who decided to go to California in the 1840s were the Donner Party. They were a group of around 80 people, including the Donner family, who were going to start a new life in California. Unfortunately, they set off too late in the year, and then en route they tried to take a shortcut, which turned out not to be a shortcut. It actually took them longer. Therefore, when they got to the mountains near California, it was already winter, and they got stuck in the mountains in the snow. Around 50% of the Donner Party died. So that was around 40 people. And the ones who survived only survived because they ate the dead. So they were stuck in the mountains in the snow and they turned to cannibalism. So around 50% of them did survive and eventually got to California. But it would have been a really traumatic experience for them. And obviously they'd lost about 50% of the people who tried to go. Another group of people who decided that they were going to go towards the west were the Mormons. Now, the Mormons went not because they wanted to find cheap land. They went because they were trying to escape persecution. The Mormons were a separate religion, and lots of people in the east of America didn't like them. They'd actually tried to live in 3 different places in the east: Kirtland, Ohio, Independence, Missouri, and then Nauvoo, Illinois. So they'd moved around a lot in the east, but everywhere they went, people hated them. Why? Well, because they were different. The Mormons had different religious beliefs. They followed the Book of Mormon, not the Bible. In their first location, Kirtland, people turned against them because the Mormons ran a bank. But when there was a financial collapse, people lost a lot of money. So they obviously blamed the Mormons. When they moved to Independence, Missouri, people didn't like them because they were friendly with the Native Americans, and they were also against slavery, which was very different to the ideas of the people there. When they then moved to Nauvoo in Illinois, they started making their own army, so that made people very angry. They told people that they believed in polygamy, so that men could have more than one wife. And again, people didn't like that. They saw it as sinful. They saw it as against God. And also their leader, Joseph Smith, decided to run for president. That was the final straw. And people really turned on the Mormons. They'd faced violence and aggression everywhere they went. But in Nauvoo, Joseph Smith was actually murdered by the non-Mormons. And that was the turning point for the Mormons. They got a new leader called Brigham Young, and they decided they had to leave the East, because wherever they were going to go in the East, people were going to dislike them and were going to be aggressive and violent towards them. They wanted to try somewhere new. And therefore, what they decided to do is go to Salt Lake. Salt Lake, at that time, was actually in Mexico. Nobody else lived there because it was a salty lake. There was no fresh water there. It was deserted. The Mormons just wanted to get away from America, so they decide that they are going to move to Salt Lake. They make sure their journey there is planned well. They go in groups. The first group built cabins along the way so that they had somewhere to stay in winter, and make sure that they had crops at these cabins so that the Mormons had food on the journey. They also created ferries to cross the rivers on the journey there. They even created their own route called the Mormon Trail, which avoided a lot of the Oregon Trail so that they were walking on their own. So the Mormons successfully got to Salt Lake. And when they got there, they had to do a lot to make it, so that people could live there. Because actually it was deserted. There was no fresh water. So what they had to do is create irrigation ditches to bring snow melt from the mountains down to Salt Lake, so that they had fresh water to drink, but also so that they could water their crops and grow food. So getting fresh water was one of the key things, and that's how they did it. Irrigation ditches from the mountains to bring water that had been snow, when it melted, would come down these ditches into the city. They also had strict rules about land. They shared land out equally and made sure that food was shared out equally. Everyone had to help grow food, and everyone had to share it equally between the people. To get more Mormons to come to Salt Lake, they created something called the Perpetual Immigration Fund. This was money to pay for Mormons to come from all around the world, so usually from South America or Europe, to come and live in Salt Lake, because they needed more people. They needed more people to build houses, to help grow crops, to help bring the water down. So they paid for these people, say from South America, that would not have been able to afford to come to Salt Lake. They paid for them to come, and that was what the Perpetual Immigration Fund was. They actually made Salt Lake very, very successful. Within a few years, there were 70,000 Mormons living at Salt Lake. They had water, they had food, and they were, successful. It didn't mean they didn't have problems. For example, the government wouldn't let them become their own state. And there was issues with education. The children were not going to school. They were too busy growing crops instead of learning. The Mormons also didn't really know how to do things like make clothes or make metal items. So it wasn't perfect, but they had food and water and they were safe. Another group of people who went in the 1840s were the 49ers. These were the gold miners. And they went in 1849 over to California because gold was found. They went in huge numbers. Around 100,000 people travelled along the California Trail to get to California in 1849 to find gold. Before gold was found there was only around 8,000 people living in California. After gold was found, that increased to 250,000 people. Most of them came over from the west, from the east of America to the west, so they travelled by foot along the Oregon Trail and the California trails. However, quite a large amount also came from China. We have a big increase in immigration from China. There was a civil war going on in China at that time, and huge amounts of people wanted to escape that civil war and come over to find gold. Now, the Chinese couldn't afford to come to America on their own, so they had to agree that if the Chinese mining companies paid for them to go to America, that they would then work for the Chinese mining companies until they'd paid off their debt. So actually, these Chinese miners were in a really, really horrible situation where they'd get to America, they owed the money for their ticket, and therefore they just had to work for these mining companies until they'd paid their debt off. Now, most of the 49ers, the people who went to find gold, never did. Some of them did, but most of them never found any gold. Most of them ended up staying in California and just becoming farmers there. In the 1840s, people had been moving all the way across to the West Coast, to Oregon and California, to farm or to find gold. Obviously, the Mormons had also gone to Salt Lake. But in the 1850s, people started to move to the Midwest, not all the way across, still moving west, but just to Kansas and Nebraska. In the 1840s, they had not been allowed to go and live on Kansas and Nebraska because it had been part of Indian Territory. So it was out of bounds. They could travel through that land to get to Oregon and California, but they couldn't actually live there. That all changed in 1854 when the government passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This allowed people to buy plots of 640 acres for $1 per acre. So, that was cheaper than land was in the East. So lots of people then went to live in Kansas and Nebraska. This made the Native Americans very angry because they had been promised that no white people would go and live in Indian Territory. But this act changed that. In Nebraska, there wasn't that many problems. People, went to Nebraska, they got land, they started creating farms. But in Kansas, we had a big issue, which led to an event called Bleeding Kansas. The issue was to do with the fact that some people who moved to Kansas wanted to make Kansas into a slave state. Other people who moved to Kansas wanted it to be a free state with no slavery. So there was the two sides, and they both wanted their own way. They both wanted control of Kansas. This led to violence between the two sides, and fighting broke out, and over 200 people were killed between the people who wanted slavery and the people who wanted it to be a free state. There was deaths on both sides, and eventually the government had to step in to stop the violence in Kansas. So that's why it's called Bleeding Kansas, because it was like a war between two groups of people. In the end, the government decided that Kansas would have no slavery. So Kansas and Nebraska both became states where slavery was banned. The other kind of big event of the 1850s is the Mormon War. Now, the Mormons moved to Salt Lake in the 40s, in the 1840s, and they'd obviously made Salt Lake to be quite successful. They'd found a way to get fresh water. They had paid for converts to come from sort of South America and Europe to boost their population. So the Mormons were doing quite well in Salt Lake City. However, the government felt that they were becoming too powerful. They didn't think it was right that a religious group had so much control. So the government decided to send the army to Salt Lake to kind of remove the Mormons from power and put a non-Mormon in charge of Salt Lake City. So the army set off, and while they were, trying to get to Salt Lake City, they hadn't got there yet, we found out that there was a massacre, so a mass killing of 140 non-Mormons at a place called Mountain Meadow. Now, these people had been killed by Mormons and Native Americans because they'd got into an argument, and then the Mormons and the Native Americans had attacked these non-Mormons. So that killing of 140 people is called the Mountain Meadows Massacre. And obviously when the army find out about this and the government find out about this, they're even more determined to get to Salt Lake and remove the Mormons from power. Now, it takes the Mormons quite a while, it takes the army quite a while to get to Salt Lake City because the Mormons had been stealing their food and things like that. But anyway, the army gets to Salt Lake City, and there is no war, there's no fighting. So even though it's called the Mormon War, there is no fighting. The army get to Salt Lake City, and instead they force the Mormons to kind of sit down and talk to them. So they just have a kind of a big meeting with the Mormons, and they remove Brigham Young from power, and they put a non-Mormon in charge of Salt Lake City and the surrounding area, which became a state called Utah. So even though the Mormons continued to live in Salt Lake City, they had lost control of it. And when they put a non-Mormon in charge, obviously lots more non-Mormons went to live in Salt Lake City and Utah. So it became a state that was mixed rather than just one that was completely controlled by the Mormons. Things massively changed again in the 1860s, and this was because of the Homestead Act, which encouraged a huge amount of people to go and live on the Great Plains that used to be Indian Territory. The Homestead Act allowed people to claim 160 acres of land for $10. This was a lot cheaper than the Kansas-Nebraska Act had been. Under the Kansas-Nebraska Act, buying land would cost $640, whereas under the Homestead Act, you could claim your land for $10. After 5 years, if you had planted crops, built a house, you could pay an extra $30 and you would then own the homestead outright. This was significantly more affordable, and lots of people left the east of America to move to the Great Plains and claim a homestead. In fact, about half of Nebraska was claimed under the Homestead Act. 80 million acres in total had people living on it because of the Homestead Act. So it brought lots and lots and lots of people to the Great Plains to farm. This increased further when the railway was built. So the railway was completed in 1869. The railway was over 1,000 miles long, and it went from Nebraska all the way to California. So this encouraged a lot more people to move to Oregon, California, and also the Great Plains. Because instead of having to walk for months along the Oregon Trail or the California Trail, they could just get on a train. That was much more attractive because it was safer, it was quicker, it was much easier. You weren't going to die along the way of a disease or an attack from a bear or from falling down the side of a cliff. The railway was built by two separate companies and then it met in the middle. It was like a race to build the fastest because the railway companies earned money for every mile they built. They earned around $16,000 for every mile they built. So therefore, they were trying to do it as quickly as possible. It was very dangerous. Lots of people died building the railway. The workers were mainly Chinese, Mexican, ex-slaves or Irish labourers. And these people, unfortunately, they didn't care about their health and safety. What they cared about was making the money. So there was huge fatalities and injuries when they were building the railway. So it's actually about 12,000 people who died during the building of the railway. But when it was built, it became obviously a massive reason why lots more people started to move to the west, especially out to California. Another big event that happened in the 1860s was the Civil War. The Civil War took place between the southern states and the northern states. But the reason that you need to know about it is because it led to the abolition of slavery. This meant that all Black Americans were free, and therefore, after slavery was abolished in 1865, a lot more Black people started to move out towards the west and tried to go out and, say, for example, buy homesteads. A lot of them also went to work on the railway while it was being built. Now, another big change in the 1860s was the cattle industry. The cows, the Texas Longhorns, were in Texas, and there was about 5 million of them. And the cattle owners in Texas wanted to take their cattle and take them up to the northeast, because that's where the big cities were, and that's where they could make the most money from selling the cattle. But they weren't allowed to take them to the northeast because the Texas Longhorns carried a disease called Texas fever. Okay, so that was the issue. They've got 5 million cattle in Texas. The cattle owners want to go and sell them in the northeast, but they're not allowed to take them there because they carry a disease. So there was laws preventing them from taking them there. So they were stuck with them in Texas. It would have been against the law for them to try and take them to the northeast. But that means they can't make profit from them. So what two people called Charles Goodnight and Oliver Loving did is they created the Goodnight Loving Trail. And this took the cows not to the east, but to the west. When they took them west, they found that they could sell them to the army. They could sell them to the government, who used them to feed Native Americans. on the Native American reservations. And they also could sell them to miners and railway builders. So that was the creation of the Goodnight Loving Trail, and it made a lot of profit for Charles Goodnight and Oliver Loving. But a lot of the owners that still lived in Texas and with their cows in Texas still wanted to get their cows up to the northeast to take them and sell them in places like New York, where there was a lot of people. So this is where Joseph McCoy comes in, and where he was able to kind of get round the quarantine laws. He created the Chisholm Trail, which took the cows, instead of towards the east, it just took them north to a town which was on the railway called Abilene. Now, the Chisholm Trail didn't take the Texas Longhorns past any other cattle. So they were allowed to walk along the Chisholm Trail because they couldn't infect any other cattle with the Texas fever. So the Chisholm Trail was fine. They were allowed to go up that. And then they got to Abilene. Abilene was on the railway. And before Joseph McCoy got there, there wasn't really anything there. But he turned it into a cow town. He built a hotel, he built pens to put the cows in when they got to Abilene. He made sure that there was water for the cows. And that way, once the cows got to Abilene, they could then get loaded onto trains and then taken to the east to be sold. That meant they weren't breaking any laws because they weren't passing by any other cattle. They were on the train, and then when they got to the east, they would be, taken to market. So that was a way for them to get the cattle from Texas to the northeast without breaking any of these laws. This led to huge amounts of profit because cows in Texas were only worth $5. But in Abilene, they were worth $50 because Abilene was the place that they could get to the east, and you could make a lot more money from a cow in the east. So Abilene was a huge success, and it massively helped the cattle industry because they were able to get the cows out of Texas and to the markets in the east by putting them on the train. And that was all Joseph McCoy. However, as time went on, the cattle owners started to realise that it was a bit of a pain taking the cows all the way from Texas, all the way up to Abilene, every time they wanted to send them to market. So a man named John Iliffe realised it was actually easier, significantly easier, to put the cows closer to Abilene on the Great Plains. And this became known as the open range, where the cattle owners, instead of keeping their cows down in Texas, they would just let them roam around on the open range, eating the grass on the Great Plains until it was time to round them up and take them to Abilene for sale. This meant it would take only a few weeks to take your cows to Abilene and get them to market, instead of a couple of months if you were taking them all the way from Texas. Now, the reason people had not done this before is because they thought that the cows couldn't survive on the Great Plains over winter. They thought it was too cold. But they were wrong, and John Iliffe proved that. They could survive winter on the plains, but also it killed Texas fever, so it actually made the cows healthier. So the creation of the Goodnight Loving Trail, and then Abilene, and then the creation of the open range helped the cattle industry because it meant lots more profit. Abilene meant that they could get the cows on the trains and get them to market. The open range meant that they weren't having to travel such long distances to get them to market. Now, homesteaders had been moving to the plains in great numbers since 1862, when the Homestead Act was brought in. And although it was massively successful and lots of people went to the plains, when they got there, they found it was much more difficult to farm there than they had thought it would be. The ground was very hard and full of tangled roots. There was hardly any water. There was no wood to build houses from. It was very windy. There was lots of pests, such as grasshoppers that would eat their crops, and buffalo that would come and trample all over their crops. As a result of all these problems, around 60% of homesteads failed, and the people went back home to the east. It was very, very, very difficult to farm on the plains. So therefore, as time went on, the homesteaders bought more and more and more machinery to try and make it easier to farm on the plains. Things like the sodbuster plough. This was a special plough that was designed for basically tough, horrible ground, because a normal plough would just break when you tried to plough the ground. And to plant crops, you have to be able to plough the ground. So the sodbuster allowed them to do that. They also bought and brought in windmills. These, as the wind turned the windmill, would pump water up from deep underground so that the homesteaders had access to water. Because there was no wood on the plains to begin with, they had to build their houses out of mud. And these houses were called sod houses because they called the mud bricks that they used sods. So the ploughs, these sodbuster ploughs, were helping them to plough the ground so that they could plant crops. They also had the windmill, so they had enough water. They also then actually had to start growing a different crop, because at first they tried to grow soft wheat. But soft wheat didn't like the dry, hot conditions on the Great Plains. So what they started to grow instead was hard wheat. It was called Turkey red wheat, and Russian immigrants had brought it over from Russia. Because actually a lot of the people who went to live on the plains, a lot of the homesteaders, had actually come over from Europe to take advantage of the cheap land. So growing the Turkey red wheat was much easier. It grew much better on the plains. Things also got even better in 1874 when barbed wire was invented, because the homesteaders could then create fences of barbed wire. Because there was hardly any wood on the plains, they couldn't actually make fences of wood. So buffalo and then later cattle were always trampling over their crops, but the barbed wire allowed them to make fences so they could protect their crops. So therefore things got easier as time went on for the homesteaders, and more of them were able to be successful. However, it did remain hard to be a homesteader. There were certain things that they just couldn't control, like the hot weather, the wind, and also pests like grasshoppers eating all of their crops. So lots of homesteaders did continue to fail. But as time went on, more and more were able to succeed. Now, the late 1860s and 1870s was kind of the height of the open range, of keeping cattle on the Great Plains to take them to Abilene to then go and sell in the eastern markets. As a result of this, one of the things that was desperately needed was cowboys. The cowboys had to look after the cattle and also take them to market. Early on, the cowboys were based in Texas, and then when it was ready to take the cows to market, they would make the journey of about 3 months up to Abilene with the cattle. On the Great Plains, the cowboys, it would probably only take them a couple of weeks to get the cattle to market because they were much closer to the train. Being a cowboy was an extremely difficult job. It was very low paid, it was very long hours, and you had to spend a lot of time outside, sleeping outside, and then during the day they would be on horseback. Most of the cowboys were very young men, and quite a lot of the cowboys were actually black Americans who had like ex-slaves that had then gone on to become cowboys. The cowboys had to do all sorts of jobs. So in winter, they had to make sure the cows were not stuck in snow and that they could find water. They had to protect the cows from wolves. That's why cowboys always carried a gun. They had to stop cattle rustlers. They had to brand the cattle in the spring. So when the new cows were born, they had to use a branding iron to mark each cow so they could prove that it belonged to their cattle owner. Otherwise, people would just try and steal someone else's cattle if it wasn't branded. When it was time to take them to market, they had to round up all the cattle and then they had to drive them to the train, to put them on the train. By drive them, what I mean is basically they'd get all the cattle in a group and then the cowboys would kind of surround them and then sort of lead them in the correct direction. One of the cowboys was kind of in charge. They were called the trail boss and they made all the decisions. And then the rest of the cowboys just basically had to do what they're told, make sure no cows are left behind and take them to market. But it was a really tough job. Other changes that were brought in the 1870s are the Timber Culture Act and the Desert Land Act. The Timber Culture Act was brought in to encourage people to plant more wood and trees on the plains because there was a shortage of wood. And when the train line was completed in 1869, the homesteaders could bring wood on to the plains by bringing it on the train. So actually the train massively helped them bring wood. But the government realised there still wasn't enough wood on the plains. Also, they thought that it would make the plains less windy because if people were planting trees, it would create windbreaks. So the Timber Culture Act said that if a homesteader planted 40 acres of trees, they could have an extra 160 acres for free. So it was basically the homesteaders could double the amount of land they had as long as they planted 40 acres of trees. Now, the Timber Culture Act was not successful because what people did was they just took the extra free land and didn't plant any trees. And even the ones that tried to plant trees failed because the trees just wouldn't grow. So the Timber Culture Act was eventually, they got rid of it because it just wasn't working. The other act that was brought in was the Desert Land Act. And this said that if a homesteader had their homestead in a very, very dry place with very, very little rainfall, that they could buy extra land for a small fee. But it didn't really work because all it did was allow the homesteaders to buy extra land, but the problem was lack of rain. So the Desert Land Act just gave them more land that they couldn't really grow very much on because it was too dry. So again, that one failed as well. Another group that you need to know about that went west was the Exodusters. They started to travel west in the late 1870s. Now, the Exodusters were black Americans. They were ex-slaves. They were people that had once been slaves in the South of America. Now they were free, but their lives were still very terrible. They still lived in the South of America. They didn't have any money. They were very, very, very low paid. They didn't own their own land. And there was still a lot of racism in the South of America from groups like the KKK who were violent towards black Americans. So to try and escape the poverty and the lack of money and the lack of good jobs, and also to escape the racism, lots of Black Americans wanted to move towards the West, but they didn't think they could afford it. They thought that they didn't have enough money. So then a rumour begins that in Kansas, the land was free. Now, this wasn't true. This was completely a lie. But 40,000 Black Americans travelled to Kansas in 1879 because they thought the land was free. And this event is called Kansas Fever, not to be confused with Texas fever or bleeding Kansas. Two different things. This is Texas fever, and it's not a disease. It is when all these Black Americans think the land is free, so they all rush to go there to try and take over that land. Now, as I say, about 40,000 Black Americans went. Unfortunately, when they got there, they found out the land wasn't free. They found out it was $10 because it was like the homestead land. So and most of them didn't have $10. The journey there was also pretty tough. A lot of them caught an illness called yellow fever on the way. So there was actually quite a lot of people who died on the way. And due to racism, people wouldn't actually let them travel on their boats and things like that. So they had to walk most of the way. So the Exodusters faced a lot of problems, especially when they got to Kansas and they found out the land wasn't free. Some of them had to then leave and go back to the south of America. Others stayed and managed to scrape together $10 to buy some land. When they did buy this land, they then faced lots of problems again because the land wasn't very good quality, so it was very, very difficult for it to farm. However, as the years went by, more and more Black Americans continued to go to Kansas, and lots of them did manage to set up successful homesteads. Some of them didn't, some of them failed and had to go back to the south. But the ones who stayed managed to create a life for themselves. And by 1880, there was about 43,000 ex-slaves living in Kansas. So there was a huge Black population there, and they'd gone to become farmers. The last little bit of the westward expansion that you need to know about is what happened in the 1880s, which was the end of the open range. There had been lots of problems on the open range for a while. There wasn't enough grass, there was too many cows, and because of homesteads, there wasn't much room on the open range left. There wasn't the wide open spaces there used to be. It was now covered in small farms. The kind of final straw was the winter of 86 to 87. During this winter, the temperatures dropped to -55 and 15% of cows died, and lots of cattle owners went bankrupt. This winter was a huge turning point. It is not to be confused with the winter in the 1860s when John Iliffe discovered that Texas fever was killed off on the plains. This winter actually made the cattle owners realise that open range is over. If cows are going to die, then they can't keep them on the open range. So after 15% of cows died over that cold winter, the cattle owners stopped keeping their cattle on the open range, and they moved them instead onto small farms, which had fences and barns that the cattle could go in winter. On these small farms, the cattle owners kept a different type of cow. They kept Herefords instead of Texas Longhorns. That was because Herefords was worth more money. So even though they kept a smaller herd of cows on these farms, because obviously they couldn't fit hundreds and hundreds of cows like they had on the open range. So they had a smaller herd, but they were a more valuable cow. So they could make more money per cow. So it was still profitable to have these small farms. It also meant that the job of the cowboy changed. They still needed cowboys because somebody still needed to look after the cows on the farms, and they also needed someone to take the cows to market. So cowboys still existed, but their jobs were different. They didn't need as many cowboys because the fences kept the cows in, and also they had smaller herds. And instead of the cowboys kind of being on horseback all the time, like riding the line, which was kind of, you know, basically doing big laps of the area where the cows were roaming on the open range, the cowboys just literally had to look after the cows in the fields of the farm, and then obviously take them to market when it was time. So the job of the cowboy did change. Different duties, different responsibilities, and less cowboys needed. The only other thing that you need to know about is the Oklahoma land rush. This happened in 1889, and it was called a land rush because people literally stood on the border of Oklahoma waiting for the signal. Once the signal had been given, they rushed over the border to try and claim land. Because before 1889, Oklahoma had still been Indian territory and no white Americans were allowed to go and live there. But in 1889, it was decided by the US government that they were going to let white people go and live on Oklahoma. So that's why we have this land rush. Lots of people trying to, you know, thousands of people trying to claim land in Oklahoma and sort of get themselves a homestead in Oklahoma.